The Paris Congress of the History of Religions. In the Paris exhibition, the Congress of the History of Religions recently sat for several days together. At the Congress, there was no room allowed for the discussions on the doctrines and spiritual views of any religion. Its purpose was only to inquire into the historic evolution of the different forms of established faiths, and along with it, other accompanying facts that are incidental to it. Accordingly, the representation of the various missionary sects of different religions and their beliefs was entirely left out of account in this Congress. The Chicago Parliament of Religions was a grand affair, and the representatives of many religious sects from all parts of the world were present at it. This Congress, on the other hand, was attended only by such scholars as devote themselves to the study of the origin and the history of different religions. At the Chicago Parliament, the influence of the Roman Catholics was great, and they organized it with great hopes for their sect. The Roman Catholics expected to establish their superiority over the Protestants without much opposition, by proclaiming their glory and strength and laying the bright side of their faith before the assembled Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Mussulmans, and other representatives of the world religions and publicly exposing their weakness. They hoped to make firm their own position. But the result proving otherwise, the Christian world has been deplorably hopeless of the reconciliation of the different religious systems. So the Roman Catholics are now particularly opposed to the repetition of any such gathering. France is a Roman Catholic country. Hence, in spite of the earnest wish of the authorities, no religious congress was convened on account of the vehement opposition on the part of the Roman Catholic world. The Congress of the History of Religions at Paris was like the Congress of Orientalists, which is convened from time to time and at which European scholars, versed in Sanskrit, Pali, Arabic, and other Oriental languages, meet. Only the antiquarianism of Christianity was added to this Paris Congress. From Asia, only three Japanese pundits were present at the Congress. From India, there was the Swami Vivekananda. The conviction of many of the Sanskrit scholars of the West is that the Vedic religion is the outcome of the worship of the fire, the sun, and other awe inspiring objects of natural phenomena. Swami Vivekananda was invited by the Paris Congress to contradict this conviction, and he promised to read a paper on the subject. But he could not keep his promise on account of ill health, and with difficulty was only able to be personally present at the Congress, where he was most warmly received by all the Western Sanskrit scholars, whose admiration for the Swami was all the greater as they had already gone through many of his lectures on the Vedanta. At the Congress, Mr. Gustav Oppert, a German pundit, read a paper on the origin of the Shalagrama Shila. He traced the origin of the Shalagrama worship to that of the emblem of the female generative principle. According to him, the Shivalinga is the phallic emblem of the male and the Shalagrama of the female generative principle. And thus he wanted to establish that the worship of the Shivalinga and that of the Shalagrama both are but the component parts of the worship of Linga and Yoni. The Swami repudiated the above two views and said that though he had heard of such ridiculous explanations about the Shivalinga, the other theory of the Shalagrama Shila was quite new and strange, and seemed groundless to him. The Swami said that the worship of the Shivalinga originated from the famous hymn in the Atharva Veda Samhita, sung in praise of the Upastambha, the sacrificial post. In that hymn, a description is found of the beginningless and endless stambha or skambha, and it is known that the said skambha is put in place of the eternal Brahman. As afterwards the yajna, sacrificial fire, its smoke, ashes, and flames, the soma plant, and the ox that used to carry on its back the wood for the Vedic sacrifice gave place to the conceptions of the brightness of Shiva's body, his tawny matted hair, his blue throat, and the riding on the bull of the Shiva, and so on. Just so, the Upaskambha gave place in time to the Shiva Linga and was deified to the high devahood of Sri Shankara. In the Atharva Veda Samhita, the sacrificial cakes are also extolled along with the attributes of the Brahman. In the Linga Purana, the same hymn is expanded in the shape of stories meant to establish the glory of the great Stambha and the superiority of Mahadeva. Again, there is another fact to be considered. The Buddhists used to erect memorial tombs consecrated to the memory of Buddha, and the very poor, who were unable to build big monuments, used to express their devotion to him by dedicating miniature substitutes for them. Similar instances are still seen in the case of Hindu temples in Varanasi and other sacred places of India, where those who cannot afford to build temples dedicate very small temple like constructions instead. So it might be quite probable that during the period of Buddhistic ascendancy, the rich Hindus, in imitation of the Buddhists, used to erect something as a memorial resembling their skambha, and the poor, in a similar manner, copied them on a reduced scale, and afterwards the miniature memorials of the poor Hindus became a new addition to the skambha. One of the names of the Buddhist stupas, memorial tombs, is Dhatu Garbha, that is, metal wombed. Within the Dhatu Garbha, in small cases made of stone, shaped like the present shalagrama, used to be preserved the ashes, bones, and other remains of the distinguished Buddhist bhikshus, along with gold, silver, and other metals. The Shalagrama Shilas are natural stones resembling in form these artificially cut stone cases of the Buddhist Dhatu Garbha, and thus being first worshipped by the Buddhists, gradually got into Vaishnavism, like many other forms of Buddhistic worship that found their way into Hinduism. On the banks of the Narmada and in Nepal, the Buddhistic influence lasted longer than in other parts of India, and the remarkable coincidence that the Narmadeshwara Shivalinga found on the banks of the Narmada and hence so called, and the Shalagrama Shilas of Nepal are given preference to by the Hindus to those found elsewhere in India is a fact that ought to be considered with respect to this point of contention. The explanation of the Shalagrama Shila as a phallic emblem was an imaginary invention, and from the very beginning, beside the mark, the explanation of the Shivalinga as a phallic emblem was brought forward by the most thoughtless and was forthcoming in India in her most degraded times, those of the downfall of Buddhism. The filthiest tantrical literature of Buddhism of those times is yet largely found and practiced in Nepal and Tibet. The Swami gave another lecture in which he dwelt on the historical evolution of the religious ideas in India and said that the Vedas are the common source of Hinduism in all its varied stages, as also of Buddhism and every other religious belief in India. The seeds of the multifarious growth of Indian thought on religion lie buried in the Vedas. Buddhism and the rest of India's religious thought are the outcome of the unfolding and expansion of those seeds, and modern Hinduism also is only their developed and matured form. With the expansion or contraction of society, those seeds lie more or less expanded at one place or more or less contracted at another. He said a few words about the priority of Sri Krishna to Buddha. He also told the Western scholars that as the histories of the royal dynasties described in the Vishnu Purana were by degrees being admitted as proofs throwing light on the ways of research of the antiquarian, so, he said, the traditions of India were all true, and desired that Western Sanskrit scholars, instead of writing fanciful articles, should try to discover their hidden truths. Professor Max Muller says in one of his books that whatever similarities there may be, unless it be demonstrated that someone Greek knew Sanskrit, it cannot be concluded that ancient India helped ancient Greece in any way. But it is curious to observe that some Western savants, finding several terms of Indian astronomy similar to those of Greek astronomy, and coming to know that the Greeks founded a small kingdom on the borders of India, can clearly read the help of Greece on everything Indian, on Indian literature, Indian astronomy, Indian arithmetic. Not only so, one has been bold enough to go so far as to declare that all Indian sciences, as a rule, are but echoes of the Greek. On a single Sanskrit shloka, Mlecha vai yavanaha, teshu esha vidya pratisthita, rishivat tepi pujyante. The Yavanas are Mlechas, in them this science is established, therefore, even they deserve worship like rishis. How much the Westerners have indulged their unrestrained imagination! But it remains to be shown how the above shloka goes to prove that the Aryas were taught by the Mlechas. The meaning may be that the learning of the Mlecha disciples of the Aryan teachers is praised here, only to encourage the Mlechas in their pursuit of the Aryan science. Secondly, when the germ of every Aryan science is found in the Vedas, and every step of any of those sciences can be traced with exactness from the Vedic to the present day, what is the necessity for forcing the far fetched suggestion of the Greek influence on them? What is the use of going to the hills in search of honey if it is available at home? As a Sanskrit proverb says. Again, every Greek like word of Aryan astronomy can be easily derived from Sanskrit roots. The Swami could not understand what right the Western scholars had to trace those words to a Greek source, thus ignoring their direct etymology. In the same manner, if on finding mention of the word Yavanika, curtain, in the dramas of Kalidasa and other Indian poets, the Yavanika, Ionian or Greek influence on the whole of the dramatic literature of the time is ascertained, then one should first stop to compare whether the Aryan dramas are at all like the Greek. Those who have studied the mode of action and style of the dramas of both the languages must have to admit that any such likeness, if found, is only a fancy of the obstinate dreamer and has never any real existence as a matter of fact. Where is that Greek chorus? The Greek Yavanika is on one side of the stage, the Aryan diametrically on the other. The characteristic manner of expression of the Greek drama is one thing, that of the Aryan quite another. There is not the least likeness between the Aryan and the Greek dramas. Rather, the dramas of Shakespeare resemble to a great extent the dramas of India. So, the conclusion may also be drawn that Shakespeare is indebted to Kalidasa and other ancient Indian dramatists for all his writings, and that the whole Western literature is only an imitation of the Indian. Lastly, turning Professor Max Muller's own premises against him, it may be said as well that until it is demonstrated that someone Hindu knew Greek sometime, one ought not to talk even of Greek influence. Likewise, to see Greek influence in Indian sculpture is also entirely unfounded. The Swami also said that the worship of Sri Krishna is much older than that of Buddha, and if the Gita be not of the same date as the Mahabharata, it is surely much earlier and by no means later. The style of language of the Gita is the same as that of the Mahabharata. Most of the adjectives used in the Gita to explain matters spiritual are used in the Vana and other Parvans of the Mahabharata, respecting matters temporal. Such coincidence is impossible without the most general and free use of those words at one and the same time. Again, the line of thought in the Gita is the same as in the Mahabharata. And when the Gita notices the doctrines of all the religious sects of the time, why does it not ever mention the name of Buddhism? In spite of the most cautious efforts of the writers subsequent to Buddha, reference to Buddhism is not withheld and appears somewhere or other, in some shape or other, in histories, stories, essays, and every book of the post Buddhistic literature. In covert or overt ways, some allusion is sure to be met within reference to Buddha and Buddhism. Can anyone show any such reference in the Gita? Again, the Gita is an attempt at the reconciliation of all religious creeds, none of which is slighted in it. Why, it remains to be answered, is Buddhism alone denied the tender touch of the Gita writer? The Gita wilfully scorns none. Fear? Of that there is a conspicuous absence in it. The Lord Himself, being the interpreter and the establisher of the Vedas, never hesitates to even censure Vedic rash presumptuousness if required. Why then should He fear Buddhism? As Western scholars devote their whole life to one Greek work, let them likewise devote their whole life to one Sanskrit work, and much light will flow to the world thereby. The Mahabharata, especially, is the most invaluable work in Indian history, and it is not too much to say that this book has not as yet been even properly read by the Westerners. After the lecture, many present expressed their opinions for or against the subject, and declared that they agreed with most of what the Swami had said, and assured the Swami that the old days of Sanskrit antiquarianism were past and gone. The views of modern Sanskrit scholars were largely the same as those of the Swamis, they said. They believed also that there was much true history in the Puranas and the traditions of India. Lastly, the learned president, admitting all other points of the Swami's lecture, disagreed on one point only, namely, on the contemporaneousness of the Gita with the Mahabharata. But the only reason he adduced was that the Western scholars were mostly of the opinion that the Gita was not a part of the Mahabharata. The substance of the lecture will be printed in French in the General Report of the Congress.